Welcome to the Happy Mindset. Today's episode number 90, and today's episode title is called Getting to Yes. So today I'm joined by Joe Garner. Joe is a 6 times New York Times best-selling author. Prior to this, he's had a career in broadcasting and entertainment. On today's episode, Joe talks about his life. He talks about how he got to where he is today. Growing up, he didn't have any ambitions to become an author. I think he said at one stage too, when he went to write his first book, people told him that he hadn't even read a book before. So it's an interesting journey he's been on, and he's achieved some amazing stuff. I met some fascinating people as well. He's gotten Tom Cruise to write one of the forewords to his book about Jeff Gordon. Jeff Gordon again is also a person that is very well known in the NASCAR community, and so he's met people like this, and he's never taken no for an answer. And the sense I get from him too is the way he's been creative about the no's he has received, how he's gone around them and maneuvered them with empathy and with creativity. So there's a great lesson on influence today. Like Joe, the sense I get from him, he's a very humble guy in spite of what he's achieved. So there's a lot of valuable insights that he shared. And he talks as well about if you've got a book idea, how to actually just begin that process and get something out there. And he also talks about how to create a book that has meaning for you and that can be successful. So yeah, Joel's a great person to talk to about all this stuff. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and thanks again for listening. Okay, so thanks for joining us today, Joe.
Sure. Nice to be with you, Dennis.
So my first question is, who are you and what are you doing in the world today?
Who am I? Let's see. Maybe that'll unfold as we talk. But my name is Joe Garner, and I have spent the better part of the last 2 decades as an author. Which is a profession that I had no idea I would ever be involved in. And it really, up until about 20 years ago, had, to my knowledge, zero aspirations of even becoming an author. It wasn't until I had the idea for my first book that's when I began to transition into that aspect of my life and my career.
What was the idea? What was the idea for the first book?
Well, I've had a lifelong love and passion for radio and television, literally as far back as I can remember. In fact, it was my mother who had the very first memory of my interest in radio and television. She would tell me that as a toddler, if she had friends that would come over for coffee, if she happened to have had the vacuum cleaner out, which had a very long hose, as a toddler, barely able to speak, I'd pick that hose up and point it at her friend and say, "What your name?" So I've been interviewing my whole life. I couldn't wait for that last square of tissue paper to come off the roller, because then I could stick a string in it and it would become a microphone. So broadcast has always been a part of my DNA. And in fact, that was my first job when I turned 16. I worked at a clothing store for about 6 months, had the general manager of the radio station say, "Gosh, have you ever thought about radio?" And so I was in first local market radio, then network radio after graduating college, and a couple of detours into television. But it was while I was in a meeting at the Westwood One radio networks back in '97, when we were talking about how to sort of, what kind of programming we could create to commemorate the passing of the 20th century into the 21st century. And I was struck by how every person in that room had a story to tell about where they were when, whether we were talking about the Kennedy assassination or the O.J. Simpson saga or Princess Diana's death and so forth. Any one of these events, like I said, everybody sort of, they were where were you when moments. They had become more than defining moments in history. And I got back to my office and I couldn't let that go. I just kept thinking about that. And then it occurred to me that every single one of those events, no matter whether they were from 40 years ago or 10 years ago, they were all introduced to us with the same 4 chilling words: "We interrupt this broadcast." And in that split second, I thought, wow, I could put together a collection of these moments. It would be like sort of a national scrapbook. And then it occurred to me that we live in a wonderful age because our history is literally recorded. So I thought, I can tell these stories in the text. I can put the iconic photograph with it, the one that's inextricable with the memory. And if I can find the actual bulletins and news coverage, I could put those on 2 compact discs. Remember, this is the late 90s. And I could put those discs into the inside back cover of the book. And I became obsessed with the idea of doing this book, not knowing the first thing about the publishing business. But I've also always sort of lived by the creed that the good Lord looks out for the ignorant and the persistent, and the trick is to be the right mix of both. So I took a book off of my bookshelf of broadcast history and looked at the name of the publisher, and I cold called them. And then that led to the next call and the next call and the next call. And after being blown out of every publishing house in New York City, a friend of mine introduced me to this small little independent publisher in Naperville, Illinois. And I met with her, and she stopped the conversation. She looked at me and she said, "I'll do this book on one condition." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "That you agree to go out and promote it, because if you've just sold me, you'll sell the American people." And I thought, well, I come from broadcast. That's the easy part for me. So I spent the next 6, 8 months putting the book together. And just before we went to press, I had the idea that it might not be a bad idea to have a name on the cover of the book that really, at that time, personified broadcast history. And at that time, Walter Cronkite was still alive. Walter Cronkite, very esteemed American broadcast journalist, and really had been in broadcast journalism from the beginning. I didn't know Walter, didn't know anybody who did, so I wrote him a letter, and I explained what I was hoping to accomplish with this mix of media, and that his words should be the first in a book about broadcast journalism. And to my surprise, about 10 days, 2 weeks later, I get a call from his chief of staff saying that Walter would be happy to provide the foreword to the book. So we put the book out in October, and by December, it hit the New York Times bestsellers list, just changed the whole trajectory of my career.
So what I was kind of curious about, what was the hardest part of that process? Like, if it seems like you were quite natural with the forming the idea, going out and making it happen. How about the writing part, the actual technical part of it? Were there any parts that were like difficult and tedious?
You know, when it came to that book, I can't really, it was the process of publishing. I was used to broadcast where you could just write down a few notes and ad-lib whatever it is you wanted to say. So when it came time to actually writing the book, I adopted Hemingway's, what Hemingway used to say about writing is, "I hate to write, but I love to have written." And that was what I discovered in the process. Coming up with the ideas, I love that. I love collaboration. I love brainstorming with other people. How can we make this book as good as it can be? That sort of thing. When it comes time to actually sitting in front of my computer and looking at that blank screen, that's the hardest part for me. But I also learned that, there are people out there that have forgotten more about publishing or writing books than I'll ever know. And you reach out to them, they're happy to give you encouragement or help you in some way or another. So I overcame that pretty quickly. It was the follow-up book that was the hard part. And I'll try to be brief on this, because I thought, gosh, now what do I do? I've got this format established. There's an audience out there for it. And it occurred to me that sports would lend itself to this mix of media. For us in the United States, you think of a seminal moment like the U.S. Olympic hockey team defeating the Soviet Union in the 1980 Olympics. It's underscored beautifully by sportscaster Al Michaels shouting, "Do you believe in miracles?" So I'm sure that there are equivalent sporting moments that are just sort of etched indelibly into time in your part of the world too, where it's that incredible play-by-play announcement that underscores whatever display of athleticism that it evoked. So I decided to do a book about sports, same format, iconic stories, iconic images, and the actual broadcast play-by-play. And I went to the head of one of the networks, sports divisions, and I said, I'm thinking about doing a sports edition of We Interrupt. And she sat back in her chair and she said, I can't believe you're going to try this. And naively, I said, well, what's the difference? And she said, well, the difference is the ownership, the ownership, when it comes to news, we own that. We pay the anchor and, we pay the reporters to go out. But when it comes to sports, the ownership is shared between the leagues and the networks. So before we can even begin to negotiate for the play-by-play, you're going to have to be licensed or sanctioned by Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, the National Hockey League, the United States Olympic Committee, and I see you have the Borg McEnroe Wimbledon bout on your list. So the All England Lawn and Tennis Club is also going to have approval rights. So, of course, I just charged back and said, well, if I can get all those people to agree, will you license me the material? And she just, dismissed me by saying, oh, sure, yeah, we'd do that. So my next call was to CBS Sports, and she wouldn't even take my call. And so I kept calling at odd times to try and catch her off guard and, maybe avoid the gatekeeper, her assistant or something. Finally got her on the phone. And she immediately dismissed me by saying, Joe, we would never participate in a project like this, nor will any of the other networks. And I said, well, I realize I've caught you at an inopportune time, but if you'll give me 30 more seconds, I'll tell you about my conversation with your colleague at ABC. And she did. There was a long pause, and she said, we'll do whatever ABC does. And then NBC followed suit, the other networks, and it was just a matter of bulldog determination at that point. I thought, now I've started it, now I have to finish it. So when it came to the next book, it was really more about just trying to get all of the rights holders to agree to be a part of it, to allow me to do it.
Oh, so like for you, what's their mindset like? Do you see that as a challenge, or were you ever daunted by that task?
Well, I can tell you that as strange as it sounds, when I hear, oh, you can't do that. Well, that's not going to happen. Nobody's going to allow that. The first thing I want to do is I want to see if they're wrong. I want to, and I think, and I'm actually able to trace that back to an event that happened in my childhood. That just before we started, I said, I think we're all sort of born with just a wide-eyed belief that we can get what we want, that we can make things happen. I mean, it's just innate in children. I want that. I need that. I'd like to, that sort of thing. And then as we mature, and maybe we fail at something, or maybe we don't have the support system behind us. Maybe people who have already sort of had that ambition sort of beaten out of them through just the knocks of life, are not that encouraging. And I thank God every day that I had the parents that I had, because I grew up in a household. I can still see the headboard of my folks. In my folks' bedroom, where my dad had books like Think and Grow Rich and The Power of Positive Thinking and all this sort of thing. So anyway, here I was, 9 years old. I was growing up in the sticks of, in the country of Illinois, which is out in the middle of no place. I mean, literally surrounded by cornfields. And here I am with this ambition to go into show business. So I was about as far away from Hollywood at that point as anybody could be. But every year in July, my father, who worked for Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance, would take us up to Milwaukee, Wisconsin for the annual convention. And what I loved about that was they would always hire some major star to entertain. Now, you'll have to go back, like I said, to 1969, but the biggest star on the planet at that time was a comedian by the name of Bob Hope. And certainly here in the States. And, he entertained presidents, and I mean, he was sort of considered show business royalty himself. And Bob Hope was the entertainer. So somehow in my 9-year-old psyche, I thought, gosh, if there's any way I could meet Bob Hope, that'll somehow further my show business career. So my father, who talked a lot about setting goals and things like that, I proceeded to sit down and write a letter in longhand to the then president and CEO of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance, explaining that what my ambitions were and my goals, and that if there were any way to meet Bob Hope, I would be grateful. So I'm sure my folks were mortified. I mean, my dad, insurance agent for this, international company and the whole thing, but they didn't dissuade me. And sure enough, just a couple of weeks later, we get this letter from the then president of Northwestern Mutual saying he would be happy to um, facilitate meeting Bob as long as I promise not to tell too many jokes and this kind of thing. He's appeasing obviously a child. But sure enough, it was held at Milwaukee Brewer, the Major League Baseball team's stadium there in Milwaukee, and I was told to go to a designated area, and then they took my dad and I and took us down into the dugout, and from the dugout into the locker room, and sure enough, all heck starts breaking loose, and it was as the president of the United States was showing up, all these cars and guys smoking cigars and things, and in walks Bob Hope. And are you Joe Garner? And I met him, and so rare is it when you have such a seminal moment in your life. Sometimes those things are just happy accidents, but in my particular case, I still have the letter, I still have the photographs, and so I have that reminder every single day. And just imagine the impact that had on a 9-year-old of, gosh, you put your mind to it, you can make it happen. So now fast forward to doing all these books and working with Walter Cronkite or Bob Costas on the sports books or Dustin Hoffman on the motion picture book. I was doing a radio interview, and the radio personality said to me, "What made you think that you could get Dustin Hoffman to work with you on a book about movies?" And it kind of took me back a little bit, and I was like, well, why wouldn't he? So I've just always kind of had that, the worst they can say is no. And so that's the attitude I've always had, and the attitude that I've tried to instill in my kids and the people that I work with.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, was your relationship always positive with the word no? Or do you remember a time when you feared the word no?
I don't think I ever did. And to this day, I don't think I ever do. I mean, I can give you a perfect example. You're familiar with the show Survivor?
Yeah.
Okay. So Survivor is owned by a company in the UK. I did a book called Stay Tuned, Television's Unforgettable Moments. And it was all about, firsts and biggest events and that kind of stuff from news, sports, and entertainment. And one of the events I wanted was the very first Survivor Millionaire episode that aired here in the States. And I called CBS, and there's no way we can give that to you. There's no way that in the company, I think it's called Castaway Company in the UK. And anyway, just very quickly, I mean, it was a no, but it wasn't a no yet. It was a no from their perspective. And I reached out to the company, and sure enough, they let me have it. So it's just, I just think sometimes people accept no. First of all, people will say no because it's easier. It's easier to just get rid of something. So no, I can't do that. No, I won't do that. No, there's no way. And so, having that in the back of my mind, I always think, I haven't been convincing enough yet. I kind of accept the responsibility that if they're telling me no, it's because I haven't properly communicated. I haven't made them feel what it is that, the benefits of this, or why, they need to say yes. So it's just always kind of been the way.
How do you go about actually improving that? Is that something you consciously improve, like in your communication to them to convince them, or is it just something you over try?
I always try to put myself in their position. If they're saying no, the first thing I try to do is to figure out, why are they saying no? What is it about what I've presented them? And I think, and this is a lesson that was taught, as well as, I guess, continuing education sort of proved this out through the years is that I'll give you an example. Another one. In the book I did called Now Showing Unforgettable Moments from the Movies, I had a scene in there. It was a book that celebrated iconic moments in movies. And the DVD that comes with the book has the actual clips. And the text of the book tells you the story behind the moment. What made it so iconic? Was it a happy accident, or was it something in the writing? Was it the performance? What was it? And Dustin Hoffman narrates the DVD that comes with it. And one of the scenes that I wanted in the book was from On the Waterfront, which was a 1950s era film that starred Rod Steiger and Marlon Brando. So the process of getting the permission to use the clip involved getting the permission of the studio, and then the performers that appeared in the clip. Rod Steiger at that time was deceased, so it was simply a matter of sending a check for a prescribed amount to the Screen Actors Guild. But at that time, Marlon Brando was still very much alive. And I wrote my letter explaining what I was hoping to accomplish with this mix of media and why including On the Waterfront in that scene where he's in the back of the taxi cab, very passionately, I could have been somebody, I could have been a contender, that sort of thing. Why that I felt that was important. So I sent the letter and followed it up with his assistant. I'll never forget, her name was Anita. So I would send the letter, that explained in sort of very complimentary terms that, the book would be less than complete, Mr. Brando, if your performance isn't included, this kind of thing. And so I followed it up with a call. And Anita said, Mr. Brando has your request, but he hasn't gotten to it yet. I'm sure he will. Okay, fine. So then I wait a few days and I'd call back. Hey, Anita, it's Joe, just calling to find out if Mr. Brando's signed. I'm sure it's on his desk, and I'm sure he'll get to it, but he just hasn't got to. So anyway, I'm sorry, but this is, this has gone on now for, probably 2 or 3 weeks. So I figured I've got to create some sort of sense of urgency. So I said, hey, Anita, it's Joe. Listen, I got a call from my publisher, and they're beginning to worry that we're hitting a deadline for printing and that we need, and she interrupted me and she said, your publisher's deadlines are irrelevant to Mr. Brando. He'll get to it when he gets to it. So I thought, okay, I've got to appeal to him on his level. And this is perhaps not very politically correct of me, but if you recall, towards the end of Mr. Brando's life, Marlon Brando's life, he grew rather large. And I thought, and I had that image in my mind, and I thought, you know what? This guy's probably got a sweet tooth. So a week or two before, I had received what I thought was a long stem box of flowers. And at the end of the stem, they were like hand-sized chocolate chip cookies. So I called my assistant and I said, find out where those cookies came from. Little place in Burbank, California, which is where my office was. And so I called over there and I had them make up a fresh baked box of chocolate chip cookies. Had it delivered over to my office, and I sat down and I hand wrote my letter to Brando, basically saying the same thing, but just in handwriting so that it looked very personal and looked, that this was something that mattered to me. Attached it to the box and had it messengered up to his home. And the next morning I called and I said, Anita, it's Joe. And she interrupted me again and she said, Joe, it must have been the cookies. Mr. Brando has signed your release. So, it's sometimes it's just, it didn't matter what I wanted. It was putting myself in his shoes and what mattered to him. And, and in his stage of life, having that box of chocolate chip cookies mattered more than anything else. So, I've always just, you have those kinds of situations come up and you resolve them. It just sort of reinforces that, what? No doesn't always mean no. It may just mean not now.
Yeah, it's very creative as well, actually. Yeah, you're empathizing with the other person. That's good.
Yeah.
How about, have you ever felt a sense of pressure from what you've achieved? Like you said, you kind of fell into writing, but you're a 6 times New York Times best-selling author. Did you ever
Yeah,
feel a sense of pressure after the first one to get the next one, or did it ever occur to
always.
you?
Yep,
Okay.
always.
How do you deal with that then?
Well, it's not easy. I mean, because uh, my first book was so I don't know how to put this. My first book was so um, successful, and I say that with all the humility in the world because I just had an idea and I felt very passionate about it, and I thought it would be something that would resonate with people. I had no thought of New York Times bestsellers list or Wall Street, none of this. It wasn't even in my world. I had no knowledge of it. So, it goes on to sell, I think just shy of 1 million copies. And that's your first book out of the gate. So now the pressure is you do it again. And what was lucky was that I discovered that sports fans were even more passionate. So wound up putting out the second one, and the crowd goes wild. And that became so popular, it sucked Winner Up this broadcast back on the list. So any historians out there that want to see what we were reading at the first week of the 21st century, the dawn of the 21st century, there's two books of mine on the list simultaneously. And I remember at the time when my publisher called, it was like, what is going on here? If this had been by design, that'd have been one thing, but it was completely, um, by accident, by stroke of luck, right idea at the right place, that right time sort of thing. So after that, um, I would always feel, okay, this one's got to do as well. This one's got to do, chasing that hit. And it can be very, very exhausting because you have to realize that, and some afterwards were good and were successful by normal standards, and some weren't. But I'll tell you a lesson that I learned really quickly, and that is that any time that I would try and do a book or had an idea for a book that I was doing because I thought, okay, this one will be successful, it never was. It's just, you can't, that isn't something that you can, it's not wash, rinse, and repeat. The ones that have been successful have been the ones that were genuinely, they were genuine passions, like the first one. And I grew up in front of a television as a child of the 60s, so my television book was very successful and that kind of thing. But any book that was just, yeah, I'll do this because I think this might be commercially successful, always, I wouldn't say failed, but didn't do nearly as well. So you really have to go, with your heart on things.
Hmm. Were you always good at following your heart?
I think so.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think so. Um, again, I was very fortunate to have the support system that I did, and get the education that I did early on. Education meaning, um, that I just heard a statistic the other day. It's probably old news to you, but a positive attitude, the brain works 31% more effectively with a positive attitude. So, and you always get what you look for. If you expect success or you expect failure, you're right. That sort of thing. I think I may have botched that saying, but you understand what I'm getting at.
Hmm.
So, that's why your the title of your show, the happy mindset, is something to literally live by, and I have always tried to do that.
That's good. Were you conscious of that from an early age? or is it something later on in life that you've grown to?
No, that was baked in from day one, like I said, and then to have the experience that I had, very seminal experience. Like I said, I've got that photograph,
Hmm.
and there's my dad standing behind me, the biggest star in the world, in front of me, and my dad's 20 years younger than I am in that picture right now. So I'm trying to put myself in his position, and I'm thinking, what is going on here?
Hmm.
Um, but no, I've always had just sort of this um, self confidence that as much as I can, I've tried to reverse engineer and use to encourage my children or the people that I work with. Because as you can imagine, I have the good fortune of having people who would like, a lot of people have ideas for books and stories, and they want to do it. And what prevents them from doing it typically is them. They just they can't seem to figure out a way to get started. And what I always ask them first and foremost, is this something you really, really want to do? Oh my gosh, yes, I really want to do it. I just don't know how to do it. And I always say, you just start. Like they'll want to do a memoir, or they'll want to do, and they become very, and I can relate to this. They become very intimidated by that blank screen. But nowadays with voice recognition and so forth, I said, just start telling yourself the story. Just take your iPhone, start recording, and don't worry about grammar. Don't worry about punctuation. Don't worry about any of that kind of stuff. Just purge and get that story out. And then there's any number of services, whether they're there's a service that I use that is artificial intelligence. You just upload your MP3. 10 minutes later, you've got a transcript. Now you don't have a blank page. Now you got 4 pages of a story that you can just go through, or you can get an editor, and editors are very cost effective. Get an editor to start, so that there's no excuses. There's no reason to not start. And so that's what I try to do, is to try to take that no that you're imposing on yourself, and turn that into a yes, because there's every reason in the world to want to do it and to do it.
Hmm, that's good. You wrote another book as well on Jeff Gordon, the
Hmm.
autobiography. What's that process like, writing somebody else's biography?
It was a first for me. Fortunately for me, Jeff and I had met in 2005, 2006. Somebody had said to me, this is an example of one of the books that didn't work. Somebody said to me, gosh, you know what? You ought to look at NASCAR, because it's massively popular. It's in the pop culture zeitgeist. There's a lot of great characters and that sort of thing. And I didn't really care about NASCAR. But growing up in the Midwest, I was certainly aware of it. So I thought, well, I'll investigate. So I looked at it and I thought, you know what? They're right. It's very popular. It's huge spectator sport. These racetracks hold twice as many as any of the NFL football stadiums that we have here in the States, and so forth. So I thought I would try it, and I approached it the same way I always approach. When I was doing something on movies, I got Dustin Hoffman to get involved, and so in this case, I thought, well, I need a driver, and reached out to a couple, and as luck would have it, Jeff's stepfather, who has guided his career literally since Jeff was 2, 3 years old, loved my books and said, come to Charlotte and let's talk. So I did, and just got along great. I mean, his stepfather, John Bickford, is just one of these people. As soon as you meet him, you think you've known him your whole life. Just a very warm person, and so wound up doing this book called Speed, Guts, and Glory, which was about great moments in NASCAR history and drivers and all this kind of stuff. But Jeff's stepfather warned me. He said, you're not going to get caught in a line of NASCAR fans at a Barnes and Noble. And he was right.
Weird.
But it forged a great friendship, great relationship. And in 2014, 2015, when Jeff decided to retire from racing, I got a call from John saying, "Hey, we're bringing down the curtain on Jeff's career as a driver. We think it's time for a biography. And would you do it?" And I said, "I'm in." So, fortunately for me, there was a foundation already because Jeff's life, there'd been a bunch of unauthorized. This was the first authorized biography. So there'd been a bunch of unauthorized biographies out there. So I was able to sift through that and kind of put together an outline from beginning to the present, and submitted that to Jeff and to John, and they weeded through it and pulled out all the stuff that was kind of BS. And because Jeff had never, like I said, he'd never participated. And then once we had a foundation down and we knew what the plot points were throughout his life, I just wound up spending the next year and a half traveling the country with Jeff, and meeting with his stepfather and his mother and his circle of family, friends, associates, that kind of stuff. Funny story, when he and I sat down for the first time to really kind of talk through how we saw the book, I said to him, is there anybody, because he has a biological father that he had a very difficult relationship with, and was in the process of repairing it, but he's character. And so I said, as delicately as I could, I said, "Jeff, is there anybody that you don't want me talking to?" Thinking he would mention the biological father. And he said, "Well, probably my ex-wife and ex-girlfriends, although I'd love to know what they have to say." So that sort of set the tone. So it wasn't, as Jeff put it, it's not a tell-all, but it's a tell-most. And we wound up putting the book out, and that one became it is called Jeff Gordon is Dream, Drive, and Destiny. And that became my 6th New York Times bestseller.
Did you enjoy that process of writing somebody else's biography?
I did. Yeah, because everything that I've done is all nonfiction. They're all previously existing stories. It's history, whether it's history in terms of politics and news and that kind of stuff, or history in movies, or history in television, or comedy, or that's always been my sort of the palette that I work from. And so this actually kind of made it a little easier. Where it got a little dicey was, anytime you're dealing with somebody's family, you're going to get different perspectives. And case in point, Jeff's stepfather had a biological son that he didn't see as much, and didn't, it's so Disney-esque when you think about it. Here's John, who, when Jeff was tiny, 1 year old, starts dating Jeff's mother because they worked in the same medical supply facility. And it just so happens that John, no blood relation, has this love of racing. And literally the first date that he takes Jeff's mother on, and of course she has to bring her 2 little ones with them, is to a racetrack. So you can only imagine, here's John sitting there with little Jeff, a future 4-time champion and Hall of Famer, on his lap. And so it was just divine intervention, I believe. But yet, spending all this time with Jeff and not as much time and involvement with his biological son. And in my conversation with his biological son, I asked him the inevitable question: "Were you jealous?" And after a little pause, he said, "Yeah, I was really jealous." And that was the first time when I played that tape and showed the quote to Jeff. That was the first time he'd ever heard it. And that's 30 years later, 40 years later.
Hmm.
So they learned a little bit about each other in the process of doing that book. And when I did interview Jeff's biological father, um, I think he was hoping that this opportunity to do the interviews with me was going to be a way of kind of rewriting history. And but excuse me, Jeff had final say on certain things, and so when I would show him the transcripts, he would look at me and he'd go, "That didn't happen that way," and then he'd just go through and tell me the real story and that sort of thing. And but I think that that was probably the biggest difference, was just I was dealing with one story in essence, but getting all primary source material as opposed to diving into the research.
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting process. Would you ever do a biography yourself one day?
Well, for me, you mean on myself?
Yep.
An
So,
autobiography? It's so funny that you should mention that, because in 2007 or 8, I thought I'd lived, like I said, I've always been a very positive person and that sort of thing. And I remember I was in my office one day, and my assistant said to me, have you ever thought about doing a memoir or an autobiography? And I said, in order to do that, I think you really have to have gone through some turmoil. You've had to have gone through some stuff. And I feel pretty lucky. I feel pretty charmed. I don't feel like I've really had a lot of adversity. And it was as if God went, oh my God, I forgot the adversity. And bam, the downturn in the economy, and people weren't buying $50 books anymore. And bam, they hit the real estate market in California, and the value of my home just plummeted. And bam, oh, here comes a divorce, and bam, all this stuff. And so I think I have, I think I have the material for something like that. But to turn inward, I it's not a no, but I'm having a more difficult time convincing this guy that he needs to do something like that. So maybe some point in the future, but nothing I'm anxious to tackle right now for sure.
okay. Oh, the other thing, actually, the foreword to the book as well was by Tom Cruise. How did that come about for Jeff Gordon?
For Jeff, well, fortunately, they had a mutual admiration. Tom grew up in Kentucky, and he used to like to take his mother's car and just tear out around, some of the rural country area that he grew up in. And then, of course, became friends with Paul Newman, and became aware of his racing and that kind of stuff. So Jeff always had, and then Jeff did Days of Thunder. So he always had an affinity for racing, and it was during Days of Thunder when he worked with Rick Hendrick, which is the team owner that Jeff was working for at the time. So that's how they became acquainted. So then, fast forward, when Jeff was inducted into the Hall of Fame, I beg your pardon. Yes, when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, Tom flew in, and he was down in New Orleans, I guess, doing a movie, and he flew into Vegas, surprised Jeff. So it just sort of seemed obvious. So I, sent an inquiry to his publicist, and she bounced it off of him. He was in London at the time doing The Mummy. And it was like, well, he doesn't have time and this sort of thing. And I said, look, I've got an idea. I said, if he'll take a 15, 20-minute phone call with me, I'll ask him questions. Excuse me. I'll ask him questions. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Still early enough in the morning here that I've got that morning frog. So I said, if he'll give me 15, 20 minutes to do an interview, to interview, I'll ask him questions that would lead to answers that he would most likely want to put into a forward, reflections on his own interest in racing, his friendship with Jeff, and that sort of thing. So that seemed to make sense. It didn't seem as laborious. And they asked Tom, and I got a call back from Tom's sister, who runs his pretty much his life. And she said Tom would be happy to do it. She said it'll most likely be. She gave me a day, but she said I don't know what time. And I said, okay, I'll just make sure that that day is, I'm flexible. And sure enough, I get this phone call, and I said, hi, this is Joe Garner. He goes, hey, Joe, it's Tom Cruise. Well, hey, Tom, how are you? It's just sort of an odd thing, very surreal, but he was wonderful. I mean, he was great. That's, like I said, that's when, I'd asked him about Days of Thunder, and he said, it actually, my love of racing predates that by, a couple of decades. And he went in to talk about how he, would drive his mom's car kind of, racing like throughout the, the Kentucky countryside and all this sort of thing. But it was terrific. So took the interview, had it transcribed, then edited it, and then sent it to him for his approval. And he made a couple of adjustments, sent it back to me, and we printed in the book, and that was that. So yeah, it was fun. I've been lucky to have some really good people do forwards periodically. I did a comedy book. One of the last things that Richard Pryor ever did was to write the forward to that book. So I've gotten lucky in that respect.
Yeah, it's quite diverse as well. Yeah, you've been in a lot of different fields like sport and comedy, and
I feel like a gypsy, and it's weird because I'll whenever I immerse myself in a book's subject, I'm there for a good year, year and a half, and you establish all these relationships and these friendships, and then you finish the book and you pull up stakes and move on to the next one. And that's the one thing that's always sort of bothered me, because I know that there have been relationships that I probably haven't been as diligent as I should have been to maintain, but there's only so much time in the day, and you're off, figuring out another world and how you're going to navigate that one. And so I would imagine it's a lot like people who are, either do a movie or a play or something like that. You forge these relationships, then you got to move on.
Does it get easier to move between worlds after a while? Like you went from like comedy to sports do you start like getting used to that process? Is there kind of a general process you'll go through each time? Or?
There's a sort of a mental acclimation, that you have to go through. And I always feel like the new kid in class, because I'm dealing with people who've forgotten more about the subject than I'll ever know. But then after 2 or 3 months and any number of phone calls and things, it becomes familiar. And then I don't feel quite like such a vagabond, that I'm here for a while and I'm really here to do a really good job. But yeah, I do go through that each and every time. It's just natural to feel like a foreigner.
Do you enjoy that? Like, do you enjoy actually having that beginner mind, always being like a beginner when you move into these fields?
I do, yeah, because it's one of my favorite parts of the process is the research. I don't think you can do this without having sort of a natural curiosity. And I do, if I'm getting ready to do a subject, I've been very, very lucky in that most often I'm doing it in association with somebody who is well established. I mean, when I was talking about Jeff and John Bickford, his stepfather, when I would walk into a track and I'm with him, it was like walking through the city with the mayor. I mean, everybody wanted to know him or knew him, and by association, I get that kind of recognition. So, the same thing with all of the books. It's just, it's intimidating too, because they are at the top of their game. And I don't want people looking at them and saying, gee, who's that idiot with them? You know what I mean? So,
Mm.
you have to really, um, you know, it it makes you want to be better. But that's in any field. You always want to try to strive to be as good as you can be, and so it's, you're sort of, what do they say, judged by the people you associate with, and so um, that's always been a real advantage, I think.
Mm. Do you ever find yourself getting bored once you are familiar with the material?
Not really, only because of the fact that I guess subconsciously I know my visit is brief.
Mm. Okay.
I'll be there for, I'll be doing this for a year and a half, and the process is such that, it's concepting, it's, coming up with the idea, coming up with how you're going to package the idea, and everything is another mountain. By the time you get to the plateau, you're jumping off to the next,
Mm.
mountain climb. So, I get somebody to do the, like get Jeff Gordon. Okay, so now Jeff Gordon, the subject is NASCAR, put together what I hope is a really great proposal. The agent sends that out to the publishers. Somebody hopefully decides they'd want to do it with me. Then it's the process of creating it. So every day is a new deadline, a new idea, new enhancement. We get the book done, time to go out and promote it. But while that's going on, it's what's the next one. So
Mm.
there's really no time to kind of
Get bored.
get bored with it.
That's good. Do you have any final advice for somebody who wants to become an author, but they want to come from a place of passion and also success?
Yeah. Um, there's no guarantee of success. Just and it depends on their motivations too. Some people want to write a book because they want their legacy, um, memorialized, and that's wonderful, and that's a valid reason to do it, I mean, a really valid reason to do it. Um, but if you're wanting to write a book to for commercial purposes, um, remember that you're entertaining, and that you and that always try and keep your reader in front of you. Don't get bogged down with the minutia. Keep your reader in front of you. Why do they want to be? I would forget that, and I was reminded of that in a very um, uh, actually sort of an emotional way at one point. I had come out with one of the sports books, and was doing a radio interview, and complete non sequitur in the middle of this interview, the co-host of the show said to me, he said, Joe, he said, the greatest day I ever spent in this life with my father was with one of your books. And I was sort of taken back, and I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, my dad and I never really had much of a relationship, but the one thing we shared was a love of sports. And he said it was Christmas Day. I'd bought him a copy of your book, and I was in his room, and he was in hospice. I mean, it was only a matter of time. But he said we were leafing through the book, looking at the photographs and listening to the CDs, listening to the play-by-play, and we started reminiscing and connecting and sharing and that sort of thing. And that really etched into my mind, who am I doing this for? What am I doing this for? That sort of thing. And it that can keep you motivated. And so long-winded way of getting around to saying that just do it, just start. If you have an idea in mind, you can think of 1,000 reasons why you shouldn't do it. But the most important thing to keep in mind is to just do it and have that, if nothing else, just that satisfaction of knowing that you followed through and that you accomplished it. And follow your passions. And there's 1,000 ways to make it perfect. Don't worry about that. Just get it down and get to it.
Mm. Good advice. How would we find you online if you wanted to check out your stuff?
Well, you can find pretty much everything at Amazon.com. Joe Garner, author. You go online, you can find me there. I'm in the process of reconstructing my website, which I should have completely reconstructed. But my company is Garner Creative Concepts, and so if you go to GarnerCreativeConcepts.com, you can find me there. And otherwise, Twitter and Instagram and all that kind of stuff. Facebook.
Cool.
I'm around.
Cool. Thanks, Joe. It was great to hear your story, and yeah, it was great to hear about the persistence you've had and the vision you've made come true as well. It's great to hear the little things that went on as well. Practical
Well, thanks,
advice.
Dennis. Thank you for letting me share.
No problem. So cool. So until next time, have fun and enjoy the process.
Perfect.